It's Friday, the 10th of March, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran. On the programme this week, the Home Secretary unveils new legislation to tackle small boats, which she says will stop channel crossings.
Make no mistake, this Conservative government, this Conservative Prime Minister will act now to stop the boats.
But Labour says the plans won't work.
We can't afford any more of this slogans and not solutions, just government by gimmick, ramping up the rhetoric on refugees but picking fights simply to have someone else to blame when things go wrong.
Conservative anger that senior civil servant Sue Gray, who investigated Partygate, is now planning to work for the Labour leader.
Does this not undervalue years of advice and reports that she has given?
NHS England admits it is set to miss a key cancer target laid out in the COVID recovery plan.
We're not going to meet the pre-pandemic target by the end of March, simply because of those record levels of demand.
And tributes in the Welsh Parliament for the 3 young people killed in a car crash at the weekend.
On behalf of us all in the Senedd, our sympathies are with the friends and families of Eve, Darcy and Rafael, and our hopes are with Sophie and Shane for a full recovery.
Let's start with events here in Westminster with Sean Curran. And, of course, the big story this week, Sean, was the government's announcement about how it's going to stop those small boats coming over the channel. What happened?
Well, Joe, you'll remember that this is a problem that the government has tried to tackle before, because it's really something that started to grow since about 2019. And last year we saw a record number of people, 45,000, making the crossing across the channel. So the government has taken action before, but at the start of the year, Rishi Sunak set out his 5 priorities for the year and the 5 promises he was going to make. And one of those was that he was going to stop the small boats crossing the channel. And there's been talk for weeks about when the government would bring forward its plans to change the law to achieve this. This week we got the first announcement of the law, and we got a statement from the Home Secretary. She was setting out the plans, and basically the government wants to say that if you arrive in the UK illegally from this week, because it's all going to be backdated, they hope, to this week, you will be detained for 28 days, and then the idea is that you'll be deported. You'll either be sent back to your own country, if it's deemed to be a safe country, or you'll be sent to what's known as a third country, which in this case means Rwanda. You'll also not be allowed to return, and you won't be allowed to apply for British citizenship. So it's a big plan. The bill was given its first reading in the House of Commons earlier this week, and the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, came to the Commons to make a statement.
In the face of today's global migration crisis, yesterday's laws are simply not fit for purpose. So to anyone proposing de facto open borders through unlimited safe and legal routes as the alternative, let's be honest, there are 100 million people around the world who could qualify for protection under our current laws. This bill enables detention of illegal arrivals without bail or judicial review within the first 28 days of detention until they can be removed. It puts a duty on the Home Secretary to remove illegal entrants and will radically narrow the number of challenges and appeals that can suspend removal. Only those under 18, medically unfit to fly, or at a real risk of serious and irreversible harm, an exceedingly high bar, in the country we are removing them to, will be able to delay their removal. Any other claims will be heard remotely after removal. The British people are famously a fair and patient people. But their sense of fair play has been tested beyond its limits, and they've seen the country taken for a ride. Their patience has run out. The law-abiding patriotic majority have said, enough is enough.
Today's statement is Groundhog Day. The Home Secretary has said anyone who arrives illegally will be deemed inadmissible and either returned to the country they arrived from or a safe third country. Only that wasn't this Home Secretary, it was the last one. And that wasn't this bill, it was the last one, passed only a year ago, which did not work. And as part of last year's bill, the Home Office considered 18,000 people as inadmissible for the asylum system because they had travelled through safe third countries, but because they had no return agreements in place, just 21 of them were returned. That is 0.1%. They could be setting out a serious plan today, and we would work with them on it, and so would everyone across the country. Instead, it's just more chaos. They say no ifs, no buts, but all of us know they're going to spend the whole of the next year iffing and butting and looking for someone else to blame when it all goes wrong. Enough is enough. We can't afford any more of this slogans and not solutions, just government by gimmick, ramping up the rhetoric on refugees but picking fights simply to have someone else to blame when things go wrong. This bill isn't a solution. It is a con that risks making the chaos worse. Britain deserves better than this chaos. Britain is better than this.
Isn't the plan behind this legislation simply this? The legislation will go through in the certain knowledge that the domestic courts of the United Kingdom will find that it's incompatible with international law and the European Convention on Human Rights, and then the Tories will fight the next general election on a promise to take the United Kingdom out of the European Convention on Human Rights. That's the whole point of this, isn't it?
Yep. Here. Home Secretary.
Well, I refer the Honourable Lady to her comments that she made about the Rwanda partnership pretty much a year ago. Many people here denounced it as unlawful, as cruel, as illegitimate. And yet we had an exhaustive and authoritative judgment from the High Court not very long ago saying the exact opposite, compliant with human rights, compliant with the Refugee Convention and lawful.
I deplore her seeking to smear migrants as a whole as criminals and rapists. And can I also assure the House that I will never vote for legislation that would have led to my parents being detained and dumped in Rwanda?
It is wrong and frankly naive and inflammatory to conflate people who come here legitimately, abiding by our laws, and come here on a legal basis, and those who are coming here breaking our laws illegally and putting themselves and others at risk.
We all hope this legislation will succeed, but will my right honourable friend promise that if it is frustrated by the European Convention on Human Rights, that we will commit to leave it? Because leave it we must, if in the end this legislation is forestalled.
In our view, this bill complies with our international obligations, and we must take these measures now promptly.
And Sean, the Prime Minister and the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, clashed over this issue at Prime Minister's Questions.
Yes, it was an incredibly noisy session of Prime Minister's Questions, very rowdy. We should say that there were quite a lot of Conservative MPs who were enthusiastic about this small boats bill. And so the Prime Minister, when he arrived, he got a big cheer. There was a lot of heckling. There was a lot of jeering. The Speaker intervened several times. I mean, almost too many times to count over the half an hour or so. And he was telling off both sides because it soon became obvious that both sides were going to shout at one another. But Sir Keir Starmer decided to devote all of his questions onto this question of this new bill to tackle illegal migration.
In the last decade, this government has introduced 5 plans to tackle illegal immigration, 5 utter failures. The problem just gets worse with every new gimmick. The Home Secretary says the public are sick of tough talk and inadequate action. Does he agree with her assessment of this government's record?
What we haven't heard is the honourable gentleman's plan. We know what it is. It's open-door immigration and unlimited asylum. Whilst he may be on the side of the people smugglers, we're on the side of the British people.
He's promised the country that this bill will stop all small boat crossings. No ifs, no buts. Sounds like more talk. So in the interest of adequate action, when will he achieve that?
The honourable gentleman has been on the wrong side of this issue his entire career. He described all immigration law as racist. He said it was a mistake to control immigration. And he has never, ever voted for tougher asylum laws. It is clear, Mr. Speaker, while he's in hock to the open border activists, we're on the side of the British people.
Mr. Speaker, when I was in charge of prosecutions, I extradited countless rapists, and the conviction rate for people smuggling was twice what it is today. I voted against his legislation last time because I said it wouldn't work. Since it became law, the numbers have gone up. He's proved me right. He should be apologising, not gloating. The Prime Minister says they will detain people who aren't eligible to claim asylum here and then return them. Well, they already tried that under the last legislation. Last year, 18,000 people were deemed ineligible to apply for asylum. That's the easy bit, the talk. But as for the action, Prime Minister, how many of them have actually been returned?
His position on this is clear. He wanted to, in his words, scrap the Rwanda deal. He voted against measures to deport foreign criminals, Mr. Speaker, and he even argued against deportation flights. Well, and we know why, because on this matter, he talked about his legal background. He's just another lefty lawyer standing in our way.
All that nonsense because he doesn't want to answer the question, because he knows what the answer is. The number is 21. I thought he was a man of detail. 21 people out of the 18,000. And what happens to the rest? They sit in hotels and digs for months on end at the taxpayers' expense.
We introduced tougher sentences for people smugglers. They opposed it. We signed a deal with Rwanda. They opposed it. We are deporting foreign offenders as we speak. They oppose it.
This is the Tory government that in recent months has spoken of invasions. Just yesterday, this was the Tory government that said that 100 million people could be coming to these shores. And this is the Tory government that this morning said that number could in fact be billions. Complete and utter nonsense. So may I ask the Prime Minister, from whom are his government taking inspiration? Nigel Farage or Enoch Powell?
Speaker. And what a load of nonsense, Mr. Speaker. What a load of nonsense. No, in fact, the figure of 100 million, it doesn't come from the government. It comes from the United Nations, Mr. Speaker. And it illustrates the scale of the global migration crisis that the world is grappling with, which is why it is right that we take action, Mr. Speaker. Because if we do not, the numbers will continue to grow. They have more than quadrupled in just 2 years. It's a sign of what is to come, and our system will continue to be overwhelmed. And if that happens, we will not be able to help the people who are most in need of our support, our generosity, and our compassion.
Rowdy scenes there at Prime Minister's question. Sean, the bill, the illegal migration bill it's called, was introduced this week. What next?
Well, the government's very keen to get it onto the statute book, and so MPs will debate it for the first time next Monday. That'll be a general debate on the principles in the bill, but it also will be the point at about 10 o'clock on Monday night when MPs will vote on it for the very first time.
Thank you, Sean, for the moment. Let's find out what's been happening in Holyrood, Scottish Parliament. Our reporter Jenny Davidson is there. And, of course, a lot of attention, Jenny, is now on this SNP leadership race and some of the more controversial comments from a rather feisty First TV leadership debate which spilled over into First Minister's questions. What happened?
Well, that's right, yes. Now, Nicola Sturgeon said she didn't watch that debate, but there were still questions about some of those more controversial elements, with the focus being on comments from Finance Secretary Kate Forbes. In her opening remarks, she said more of the same would be a manifesto for mediocrity. And then when it came to the three candidates cross-questioning each other, she really laid into Health Secretary Hamza Yousaf's record as a minister, in his record in transport and justice, in health. She talked about trains running late. She talked about long waiting lists. Now, of course, some of this is a bit of a gift to the opposition, and Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross was clearly enjoying quoting back some of these comments at First Minister's questions.
The current Finance Secretary said that the current SNP government leaves trains that never run on time, the police service stretched to breaking point, and record high waiting times in our NHS. That's a quote sorted for every Scottish Conservative leaflet going forward. And there's even more material that we can use. Kate Forbes said, more of the same is not a manifesto, it's an acceptance of mediocrity. The First Minister might expect to hear that from me, but did she really expect to hear that from her own Finance Secretary?
First Minister. Well, you see, Presiding Officer, I am very, very aware that for Douglas Ross, mediocrity, of course, is a dizzy height that he's never come close to achieving. I'm most appreciative. He's taken me into other subject matters. So briefly, Presiding Officer, he talked about crime. So let's talk about the record of my government, endorsed 8 times in 8 years under my leadership by the Scottish people. Crime down by more than 48%. Violent crime alone down by 48%. Automatic early release.
Excuse me,
ended.
First Minister. Let's have one speaker at a time, please. First Minister.
Automatic early release ended, of course, opposed by the Scottish Conservatives. We see re-offending rates amongst the lowest ever, the highest number of police officers than any time during previous Scottish administrations, higher proportionately than any other part of the UK, strengthened the law on domestic abuse.
Now, there's been a bit of a mixed response to Kate Forbes' comments, some in the SNP thinking she went too far. Indeed, the SNP's deputy leader, Westminster, Mary Black, suggesting Kate Forbes could split the party. But Kate Forbes herself has defended her comments. She said that both SNP members and the public want someone with the guts to say what needs to change, and the candour and the honesty to say it. But of course, this is the risk with any party leadership race, that they break ranks, that they start infighting, and it can cause damage within the party, to the party.
Jenny, there were also questions at First Minister's questions on health and the number of people on NHS waiting lists who are choosing to pay for private healthcare. Tell us about it.
Yes, indeed. Of course, we've had many questions on NHS waiting lists. This one in particular was in relation to an opinion poll run by the BBC. Now, the responses found that more than 1 in 5 of those responded, either they themselves or a family member, had paid for private health care in the last year. Around 9% had paid for it themselves, 13% another family member had. And nearly 3/4 of those said they would have preferred to go to the NHS. And this was a subject of a question at First Minister's questions.
The Private Healthcare Information Network tells us that the number of private operations has increased by 72%. And in 2021 alone, 40% of all hip and knee replacements were done privately. Even the Health Secretary's targets for ending the longest waits of over 2 years have all been missed, each and every one of them. Now, just a few months ago, NHS Board Chief Executives were discussing a 2-tier system of healthcare in Scotland, with some people paying for their care. Does the First Minister now accept that in reality, under this SNP government, the 2-tier system is already here?
First Minister.
No, I don't. But I do consider it unacceptable that any patient has to pay privately for treatment that they should be getting and want to get on the National Health Service. That is why we continue to focus in the ways that I have been speaking about in bringing down waiting times, and we will continue with that focus, and I know it will be a priority for whoever succeeds me as First Minister, as it has been a priority for me. In Wales, where Labour are in office, self-funded private care, according to the Private Health Information Network, was 27% higher than it is in Scotland. And not just that, presiding officer, the rate of increase in Wales for those opting to self-pay for private health care was 21 percentage points higher in Scotland, in Wales than in Scotland.
Now, that wasn't the only health-related question this week, with wider questions also about NHS waiting lists. Now, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon insisted the waiting lists were being cut down, progress was being made, but Labour leader Anas Sarwar suggested none of the 3 SNP leadership candidates were up to the job of fixing the NHS.
Jenny, there's also been further controversy over the deposit return scheme this week. Why?
Well, yes, we've heard concerns on various fronts about whether this scheme is ready to go into operation. It's due to start in August. A lot of the concerns so far have been from producers about the costs of the scheme. This time it was about shops who will be actually taking back the bottles and cans for return. Question from SNP, MSP and former Government Minister Fergus Ewing about a change to the payment terms for shops that have an automated reverse vending machine. They'll be paid in a month rather than a week, as was originally planned. He was questioning the impact of this and that said the decision had been made without consultation with businesses. Now, Circular Economy Minister Lorna Slater was asked repeatedly what she'd known about this and whether she was consulted.
Businesses have been misled, duped and deceived by Circularity Scotland. There's irrefutable proof of that. The Minister has completely failed for the second week running to answer relevant, pertinent, vital questions. Can I ask again, was she consulted by CSL on this unwarranted, unheralded and non-consulted change from changing 7-day payment to 1-month payment, if indeed that's ever achieved under this scheme? Was she consulted, yes or no?
Minister. Circularity Scotland is a private, non-profit company, and it is responsible for operating the scheme, including setting retailer handling fees. As set out in the DRS regulations, the Scottish Government is not involved in setting retailer handling fees. The fee was agreed after extensive knowledge-gathering exercise, which included analysis and modelling by PwC, which was appointed by the scheme members.
And that's not the only question around the deposit return scheme this week. There's also been some toing and froing between the Scottish and UK governments over whether the UK government's going to grant an exemption to the UK Internal Market Act for the scheme, and it's still not clear whether they're going to do so.
Thank you, Jenny. Jenny Davidson there at Holyrood in Edinburgh. Let's return to events here in Westminster with Sean Curran. There's been criticism, quite a lot of it, over Labour's reported plan to appoint the senior civil servant Sue Gray as Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff. Now, she, of course, famously carried out the investigation into Partygate and COVID lockdown gatherings in Downing Street when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. Now, on Monday, there was quite a lot of anger amongst certain Conservative politicians.
Yes, Sue Gray, probably the most famous civil servant in the country. The news that Labour had approached her leaked out last week, and that immediately led to some Conservatives saying, well, this calls into question the whole Partygate inquiry. And we were told at the weekend that certainly supporters of Boris Johnson wanted to ask an urgent question in the Commons about it. Now, this is kind of interesting because urgent questions are normally used by opposition parties or by backbench MPs to basically force a minister to come to the Commons and make a statement at the dispatch box and then answer questions. Most of the time, 9 times out of 10, they are used to put the government on the spot. So, first of all, it was kind of an interesting situation. Here we were going to see them use this device, normally something to hold the government to account, but in order to ask questions basically about Labour. Well, in the end, we didn't get a question from one of these Boris Johnson supporters. It was, in fact, from a former Lord Chancellor, Sir Robert Buckland, and he asked quite a straightforward, neutral question. Nevertheless, he did get a minister from the Cabinet Office to come, and it did seem that although, I say, on the whole, ministers are dragged to the dispatch box, on this occasion, the minister seemed quite happy to be there answering questions about this.
The House will recognise that this is an exceptional situation. It is unprecedented for a serving permanent secretary to resign to seek to take up a senior position working for the Leader of the Opposition, regardless of the details of the specific situation. I understand why members of this House and eminent commentators outside have raised concerns. The impartiality and perceived impartiality of the civil service is constitutionally vital to the conduct of the government, and I'm certain all senior civil servants are acutely aware of the importance of it being maintained. Ministers must be able to speak to their officials from a position of absolute trust, and so it is the responsibility of everyone in this House to preserve and support the impartiality of the civil service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd also like to thank members opposite for asking why a senior civil servant, famed for their integrity and dedication to public service, decided to join the party with a real plan for Britain, rather than, Mr. Speaker, a tired-out, washed-up, sleaze-addicted Tory government. This is the exceptional circumstances that the Minister spoke about. A party so self-obsessed that they are using parliamentary time to indulge in the conspiracy theories of the former Prime Minister and his gang.
Does this not smash to pieces the idea of an independent civil service when we know that one of the most senior civil servants in the country was conniving in secret meetings with the party of opposition? And does this not undervalue years of advice and reports that she has given?
We mustn't tarnish the whole civil service by one appointment, but it is the opposition playing fast and loose with a set of rules designed to protect the impartiality of that civil service that we all know is so important constitutionally for our country.
The faux outrage and wild conspiracies from the party opposite are kidding nobody. Can I remind the Minister of the words of a predecessor of his as Cabinet Office Minister, the noble Lord Maud, who said that he'd worked with Sue Gray for 5 years and, I quote, Mr. Speaker, never had the slightest reason to question either her integrity or her political impartiality, and went on to add that the Leader of the Opposition is, and I quote, fortunate to have secured her services. He's right, isn't he?
I too have worked with Sue Gray. I've admired her advice and I have had no reason to question her integrity. That doesn't mean, however, that this has been the way we should conduct these kind of circumstances. I think I'm very disappointed, or I am very disappointed, in the actions of the Labour Party. I'm very disappointed in how this has come through, and I think there are real concerns about the impact that may have on the perceptions of impartiality more broadly.
Now that Sue Gray, with knowledge of the most sensitive details of government ministers, has agreed to work in a political capacity for the Leader of the Labour Party, how can the government ensure that other ministers are protected from political stitch-ups?
There is a means by which civil servants who choose to leave the world of the civil service and even take on political roles can do it. It's just really important that we know, and ministers know, that the rules are going to be followed in those circumstances. And we need to know that they have in this. That is why we're looking as to what took place, and the Labour Party could help us.
Well, it was quite a heated debate there on Sue Gray. Moving on to health, Sean, we know that there is a substantial backlog of people waiting for hospital appointments and for care following the pandemic. MPs have been told this week that the NHS will miss a key target for reducing cancer waiting times in England. I think it was supposed to be March 2023, so March this year. What did they hear?
Yeah, so basically, if you go to your GP because you're worried that you might have cancer, and your GP then says, right, I'm going to have to refer you urgently, the idea is that you'll get your initial treatment, your treatment will start, or you'll be given the all clear within 62 days. Even before the pandemic, there was a backlog. The pandemic, of course, has made it worse. And this week, MPs on the Health Committee heard that, as you say, the government is going to miss, or the Health Service is going to miss the target of getting back to the pre-pandemic levels this year.
We've made very significant progress. So the backlog was at an all-time high of around 34,000 last summer. Last week it was 23,500. So we've dropped by around 10,000, but there's still further to go. The reason that we're at 23 and not exactly at pre-pandemic levels is that we've seen record levels of urgent cancer referrals since March 21. We're not going to meet the pre-pandemic target by the end of March, simply because of those record levels of demand.
Given that some understanding towards why we're not back at pre-pandemic levels, if we're in March 23 now, when will we be?
The target for March 24 is under discussion. What isn't under discussion, which is agreed, is that we will meet the 75% threshold for faster diagnosis, the new standard for faster diagnosis within 28 days by March 24. So that's around, it's just under 71% at the moment. We are confident with all the measures we're putting in place that we will meet that. We hope to do it much earlier than March 24, but that's the backstop, and that's really important for survival.
For people listening in the sector, March 23 has become March 24. I mean, that's how, if I was a newspaper headline writer, that's how I'd put it.
Sure. And I don't think anybody is comfortable with the fact that we have a large number of people who are waiting too long to get their diagnosis and start their treatment. What we need to do is contend with, as Callie says, a very large number of referrals. Between 200 and 250,000 people every month are referred for investigation of possible cancer, of whom only about 6% happily will have cancer, which is about a quarter of all GP referrals into secondary care are for suspected cancer.
For people waiting, and clearly not all of those people will have a diagnosis, but for those waiting, clearly this impacts on their outcomes. And at the pace we're moving forward, we could be talking about 10 years before we actually reach those targets. So I want to know, what are the limiting factors of moving ahead even faster?
The total volume in the 62-day pathway and the backlog are both down. So they're both going in the right direction.
Slowly.
But of course it is hugely anxious for people who are waiting, and they're waiting longer than I would wish them to.
Outcomes for people in more deprived areas, survival rates are much lower. I wonder if you could please explain why that is and what you're doing to tackle that.
Talking to colleagues in Kent and Medway, some people just say, I've had my innings, I'm not coming forward, doc, I'm fine, I'm 60. We need to get past that. We can do so much for people. So there's a cultural issue, there's a fear issue, so we've tried the fear campaign, and then there's a practical issue about getting access to services and making sure we eradicate variation in people's ability to access fast diagnosis and then precision treatments.
Sticking with health, Sean, Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, was questioned this week about NHS strikes in England. What's happening?
Yes, well, Steve Barclay, along with NHS bosses, has been holding talks with the unions, and we think there'll be talks next week as well. And some groups, like the Royal College of Nursing, have said they'll put their strike action on hold. But next week, we are expecting to see junior doctors in England go on strike for 72 hours. And during that committee hearing, it was said that that would make the backlogs worse.
Speak to you in a few minutes' time. Let's go to Cardiff and our Wales political correspondent, Cemlyn Davies. Cemlyn, tributes were paid in the Senedd this week after 3 young people tragically were killed in a road collision last weekend.
Yes, Joe, this a tragic incident, as you say, that claimed the lives of 3 young people in their early 20s. 2 others, aged 32 and 20, who were in the car when it crashed on the outskirts of Cardiff, are still in critical condition in hospital as well. And on Wednesday, the presiding officer here paid tribute on behalf of the Senedd.
I'm sure our thoughts are with the families of the 3 young people killed in St Mellons over the weekend. One of them, Rafael, I remember watching playing rugby in the same team as my nephew in primary school, playing for Cric, Clwb Rugby Cymraeg, Caerdydd. Such a young, fast talent on the rugby field. And on behalf of us all in the Senedd, our sympathies are with the friends and families of Eve, Darcy and Rafael. and our hopes are with Sophie and Shane for a full recovery.
Now, the 5 young people had all been on a night out in Newport last Friday before being reported missing. The crashed car was later found just after midnight on Monday morning, and questions have been asked about the speed of the police response, as we heard here on Wednesday.
The police response is now the subject of an independent office for police conduct inquiry. It would be wrong to preempt any findings of such an investigation, but you cannot ignore the public disquiet from the families and the friends of the crash victims. Just this morning, the BBC reported that Winston Roddick, the former Police and Crime Commissioner for North Wales, has commented on the police response. He was surprised about the lack of action given reports that the phones and social media accounts of the young people involved had been inactive between their disappearance in the early hours of Saturday until they were found almost 2 days later.
Gwent Police and South Wales Police, as I've said, have referred themselves to the Independent Office for Police Conduct, and they will look at exactly what happened and what happened in terms of the circumstances around this terrible tragedy, covering the points that you've raised this afternoon.
Well, South Wales Police and Gwent Police have said they can't comment ahead of that pending investigation.
Cemlyn, members of the Senedd debated the Welsh Government's roads review this week, which led to a rather unexpected vote result. What happened?
Yes, that's right. This debate that was brought by the Welsh Conservatives in response to the review recently announced by the Welsh Government into its road building plans. Now, that review put a stop to a number of projects across Wales because of the environmental concerns attached to them. But there has been criticism of the review on economic grounds, for example, but also because of the way it was carried out, as we heard here on Wednesday.
The way the recent roads review announcement was made was nothing short of a shambles. The Deputy Minister's statement in this chamber just before recess was, in my view, one of the worst statements that I have ever heard to date. A statement about the roads review conclusion which didn't actually outline what roads had been given the go-ahead and which had been given the chop.
The aim of the review, as I understand it, is to base decisions about roads on a wider range of criteria. It is nonsense to say that the roads review means Wales is closed for business.
I have not been involved in any of this. Most of this discussion takes place from the Welsh Government and Plaid Cymru, of which many of us on our benches are left out.
We are moving forward into a bright, economically and environmentally sustainable future, whereas as this debate shows, the Tories are locked in a false, overly nostalgic vision of the past, and they want a dystopian future where more and more of our countryside is devastated by traffic and our climate and the essential natural world that sustains it is driven to its knees.
So a flavour there of the debate on Wednesday. A non-binding vote was then held where Labour's MSs, including the First Minister, voted with Plaid Cymru and the Conservatives to pass an amended motion that was critical of the review. In particular, it criticised the lack of engagement with the public over the plans. The government later said that the public would be consulted as schemes are now developed in the future.
Now, Cemlyn, it's become almost weekly further discussions this week about the Health Board in North Wales that have been put in special measures.
Yes, the troubled Betsy Cadwaladr Health Board, Wales's biggest health board, serving the North Wales region. It was put back into special measures a couple of weeks ago by the Welsh Government following a damning audit report. Now, the opposition parties have been very critical of the way the Welsh Government has handled the situation in the Betsy Cadwaladr Health Board area. Last weekend, Plaid Cymru's health spokesman called on the First Minister to sack his Health Minister, Eluned Morgan. This week, he called for a public inquiry.
One former independent member of the board effectively sacked last week. A highly respected individual has suggested that there is more than enough grounds to have an independent inquiry now. The fraud investigation, the maladministration, the poor oversight of major contracts worth millions of pounds. They say they're convinced that the recent Wales audit report in itself offers enough grounds for that. So 8 years of a failing health board. means 8 years of poor staff morale, and I feel for every one of them. It means 8 years of a population poorly served. We need to know what's been going on for those 8 years and more so we can protect the public. Will the Minister agree to my call for a public inquiry?
I'm certainly not going to agree to a call for a public inquiry because I think we need to get on with the job, and a public inquiry is going to distract people from the job that needs to be done.
Well, the Health Minister is holding further talks with the Health Board today. She's in North Wales ahead of the Welsh Labour Spring Conference in Llandudno this weekend.
Cemlyn, thank you very much. Cemlyn Davies there at the Senedd. Let's return to events here in Westminster. Sean, we've heard an awful lot about the problems of the number of over 50s who are not in work as the government sees it either through choice or illness. What's being discussed?
Yep. The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, would like to get over 50s back into work. He thinks that that's going to be something that would help grow the economy. This week, MPs got the chance to question work and pensions ministers, and they raised this issue. But they also raised concerns that emerged in a survey that quite a lot of people over 50 have got concerns about the way that would-be employers view them. So there was quite a lot for them to discuss.
Research published by the Phoenix Group today on economic inactivity in the over 50s stated, and I quote, "Flexible work, support with new technology and opportunities to work from home are favoured support strands in people returning to work." So will the Secretary of State back Labour's plan to make flexible working a force for good for all workers?
Yeah. Flexible working is the way forward, not just for the over 50s, but also often for those who have disabilities. This is a big opportunity that we need to seize.
Many working parents would return to work if they could afford childcare, but at the moment, many are expected to find hundreds of pounds, sometimes £1,000 to pay for childcare costs up front. I mean, who has £1,000 down the back of a sofa? Will he make universal credit work by introducing more flexibility in the way in which universal credit operates, or is he prepared to punish hard-working parents by pushing them into more debt?
He will have to be patient. There will be some things that I'm confident that we will have to say about the matters that he has raised, but he will just have to wait another couple of weeks before he learns what we're doing.
As you know, by the way, because of my youth, I don't have to declare an interest. But does my right honourable friend agree with me that older people on the whole tend to be more punctual, tend to be more dedicated, tend to be more reliable, tend to be able to spell? What is my right honourable friend doing to tell employers that these are the very factors that need to employ them?
Well, of course, my little friend, who is under the age of 50, I'm sure, does not need to declare an interest in the desire of this government to ensure that we have more over 50s in employment. He will be aware, however, that there are 4 jobs fairs open to 50-plus customers from Lichfield that have been held across Staffordshire and Derbyshire in the last few months, and planning is underway to deliver another event very shortly.
Can I add my voice to this call for using talented people who are over 50? I'm approaching that stage myself, Mr. Speaker, and I have to say that some of the very best years of my life were after 50 in terms of the number of jobs that I have been able to do. I know many people just waiting for that second chance to contribute to our economy and to social enterprise if he gives them the right incentive.
Well, the honourable gentleman is right. I agree with him. There is life in the old dog yet, as they say. And more particularly, it is very important that we continue to make the case that employment for over 50s is something that should be supported by all employers.
A cheer for the over 50s there, Sean. One thing we do know that is happening next week is, of course, the all-important budget statement from the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. We'll have a special programme on Wednesday from 11:15 until 3 o'clock on Politics Live. But from all of us here, for now, bye-bye.